Welcome back to Heads and Tails with me, Henry. I'm one of the founders at Oppenheimer Education. I'm so grateful and delighted to have Dame Sally Coates with us today, who really does need no introduction. And knowing that no one wants to hear from me and wants to hear from someone who's been teaching since the 1970s and been through Peckham and Camberwell and White City and Hammersmith and Fulham and all sorts of different places to leading secondaries as United Learning. I'm really excited to hear from Sally today. So thank you for being with us. I would love to start with just a little context from you really on your own education and background, and perhaps we can take it from there.
Okay, hi Henry, and lovely to be on this. So my own education is really ordinary and nothing special. Sometimes I want to make it something special, but it's not. I suppose my family background was kind of lower middle class. My mother was a stay-at-home housewife. My father worked as a salesman, so nothing special. But he earned just about enough money to send me to an independent school, which was a very small Catholic convent school where we were taught by nuns, and we were in classes of about 15, and it was just one class in each year, and it was very small. And as you say, I've been around for a long time, and growing up in the 50s and 60s, I suffered from, I think, some women did back for trend, but my secondary school, my convent, was very much about learning to be a mum, really, and not expecting you to go to work. So we had very little careers advice, and education was pretty poor. So I did okay at O-levels, which is what we did. And then I went on to, because the school didn't have sixth form, went on to a school called Maidstone Girls Grammar, which was highly academic and full of really focused women and girls who were very into careers. And it was a complete shock to me. I didn't do particularly well at A-levels. I just kind of scraped through with a couple of Bs. Then went to teacher training college and trained to be a teacher. So kind of not really, nothing stunning about my background. I was the first person in my family to go to university. After me, my younger brother then went to university, and my older brother then, who'd went to a secondary modern and then went on to further education and eventually became a professor at university. So he did go, but we didn't come from a family where it was important to, people hadn't gone to university, although we had a lot of books in my home. So I'd like to say, I went to Cambridge and got a stellar degree and did really well, and nothing really special. I went to teacher training college. I did want to go to university, really. I didn't want to go to teacher training college, but my grades weren't good enough. And so kind of as a second best, but actually, during those days, you did a 3-year teacher training, and then you did the 4th year, which was your degree. And during the first year, when you do teaching practice, I discovered I absolutely loved teaching. So I had no intention of being a teacher, but like really got a taste for it. And so in the first year, I was desperately trying to leave because I did do an S level, which was something which I don't think they have nowadays, which is a little bit higher. I got a distinction in that. So I was desperately trying to get into university, but then decided after my first teaching practice, I really loved teaching. So I stayed at teacher training college and did my degree in the 4th year. So so nothing special, I'm afraid.
Do you think that background made you hungrier to achieve? Did it make you more ambitious within the school environment that you then found yourself in teaching? Or
sometimes I think, obviously I have been successful in my career, and you think back, well, actually, what I didn't say is that my father died when I was young. I was only 12 when my father died. And then he was the breadwinner, and my mother was the person that had never gone to work and had just been a housewife. And she had 4 children. There were 4 of us. And so suddenly he had no insurance or anything like that. So suddenly she had to go out to work, and suddenly everything around the house changed. And we had to kind of step up as children and kind of do things that we'd never done before. And so I became much more I kind of took control of lots of things in the house. And I think I learned, it was obviously an awful experience to go through, but I became much more resilient and much more confident because my mum kind of fell to pieces and couldn't cope. She did eventually kind of get back on top of things. But for those first few years, I had to really step up. And so I think that kind of desire to do really well and to push ahead and to lead kind of maybe came from that experience. And because because I have been successful in my career, and you sometimes think, why have I, you know? So maybe it's that experience.
It's almost like an early example of subconscious student ownership.
Yeah.
You know, getting people really autonomous, really independent early on. Were you lucky enough to have experiences of mentorship? Did you feel there was someone or some process that guided you particularly through those early years?
Well, and I know you're going to ask me about being mentored. I don't think I've ever really been mentored. And I know it's something that's really important. And I always think it's something really important for other people. I can't really think of any person in my early life who mentored me. Possibly my brother. I had an older brother. And possibly I had an English teacher at sixth form who I really liked a lot and made me love English. And she kind of took me under her wing a bit. So maybe her. But I think throughout my career, I've never had really one mentor. I've had lots of different people I turn to for advice and support, rather than just having one person at any one time, I think. So I do think being able to talk things through and somebody to help guide you and support you, particularly when things get a bit difficult, and just talking through things is really important. But I don't think I've ever had anyone particular in my life. It's just been lots of different people.
And I think that experience is actually very reflective for, or very, very true for lots of people. So it's not the first time I've heard that as an answer. Can I ask, with those early days, it was Peckham, your first school, I think, is that right?
Yeah.
You start there as an English teacher. Perhaps you could reflect a bit on those early experiences, boots on the ground. How was it?
It was rough, actually. It was rough because starting teaching in the 70s, which is when I started teaching, there was no such thing as an NQT. There was nothing particular given to you as a young new teacher. And schools, when we ever think that behaviour is bad in schools, it was much, much worse. And Peckham Girls, it was a girls' school, was enormous. It had 11 forms of entry. Just imagine 11 forms of 30. So it was an enormous school. Children weren't known, you just know your class, you knew your classes, you didn't know anyone else. It was just so massive, and behaviour was really poor, and you basically had to survive by getting it right in your classroom. But once you're on the corridors, it was like, anything could happen to you, and people were, teachers were punched. There were fights which you couldn't stop. There was a lot of racism and sexism, to be honest. And there was a lot of really inappropriate, unprofessional conduct by teachers as well. So looking back, I think education has massively improved. Children were not, the bottom sets got very poor teaching. And nobody, particularly they did CSE, was O-level and CSE in those days. And there was no accountability, there was no league tables, and nobody knew how schools did or performed. And so on exam results day, nobody even really bothered looking at, it was just awful. And there were a lot of teacher strikes actually in the early days. People were very poorly paid, and it's very disruptive in terms of strikes. And I went on strike a few times. So it was very much like the rule of the jungle. I think it was pretty awful, and I think education is much better. When I talk about racism was ignored at times. ILEA, who kind of ran London schools at that time, the Inner London Education Authority, then kind of started coming down much harder on racism and sexism and things. But in the original days, it was awful.
How that experience in Peckham Girls with the size of intake and the cohorts of 11 forms, how does that force you to reflect now on the size of schools? Within United, you probably have very different sizes of schools. What's your kind of line on that issue?
I think it's really important that every child is known, and somebody knows, you know, and somebody knows that child really well in every school. And if possible, every child is known by as many teachers as possible, and you know their names. And I think when schools get too big, it becomes really difficult to do that. So you know, the kind of charter schools in America started, because they've got enormous schools in America, they started doing this school within a school. And actually in the early days, that's what ARC did. And when I went to Burlington Danes, it had schools within schools. That doesn't really work. It just creates separation within a school and people feeling, you know, against one another, and like it rivalry and things. So I think in fragile areas, and particularly in disadvantaged areas, schools should be smallish. Can't be too small, otherwise you can't put on the wide, broad curriculum you need to. But I would say sixth form entry is kind of the maximum. And actually, even out of London and in more affluent areas, I wouldn't go higher than 8. So between 4 and 6 forms of entry in disadvantaged areas, I think keeps the school to be more, you know, you want the school to be like a family, like an extension of a family, a place where you're valued and loved and known and taught and nurtured and all those things as well, you know. So so I don't agree with really enormous institutions. So I think 6 forms of entry is about right.
That's interesting. I feel like one of the key ingredients we're finding works with the programs and the platform we're trying to build is having different year groups know each other and different age groups begin to socialize or create in-school cohesion. And it's definitely one of those things surveyed, which is still a real struggle, I think, in the UK wide across the education system, is children of different ages understanding each other. And having that power of a high five in the corridor and someone to kind of look up to. Maybe that's the subconscious mentorship that they
there
need.
are schemes like year 10 buddies with year 7 when they come in, every year 10 mentors or buddies with a child in year 7. That works really well. Or having a house structure in a school where children in different year groups are in different houses, that kind of healthy competition, but mixing with children outside your year group. I mean, you do feel more affinity with children in your year group because they're going through the same things as you, the same age, you know, same problems, same issues and things. But I definitely think, you know, the ways you can encourage older and younger children to work together is really something you should do.
At the other end of the spectrum, I guess you've got issues around discipline. I know you've written and spoken about this quite a lot. I'd love one key from you think, on creating good discipline in schools. What works through your experience?
So good discipline is about culture. So it's about, I mean, I could say 4 C's. It's about culture, clarity, consistency, and communication. So you have to get the culture right. So it has to be a place where people want to be. So staff have to feel valued and looked after, and you know their well-being has to be part of your priority list. And children have to feel loved and known, and their well-being is one of your priorities as well. And school needs to feel nice, it needs to feel warm, the environment needs to be stimulating and colourful and bright and friendly. Everybody, every member of staff needs to be warm and nice and kind, and kindness needs to be an important value in the school. And children need to want to come to school. So if they've been away, you talk to them, you know, how are you today? It was good to see you back. So the culture is, so that's really important. Children need to want to be there, and staff need to want to be there. And once people want to be there, they don't want to be excluded or suspended. So because they want to be in school, it's a safe, happy place to be. So that's the first thing. So the culture. And then rules and procedures that you have to be clear and simple and easy to understand. And they have to be consistently applied across the whole school, and they have to be communicated. So when you decide that you have a rule for behavior, that if you misbehave like twice, you get a warning the first time. If you misbehave again, you're going to get sent out, you know, to a reflection room or something. That message has to be communicated really clearly to children about why you're doing it, and just make sure everybody's clear about the consequence of misbehaving, and that they buy into it because they know if they behave, they're going to get better learning, they're going to get higher grades, they're going to achieve more. And that's why we're doing it, not because we want to punish it. So you have assemblies, somebody like the head has to lead the assemblies, and at the end you do a few assemblies about the rules and the reasons for them, and then you say, look, does anybody not understand? Anybody want to stay behind and discuss these with me? Do you need me to communicate this anymore? Do you really understand? Put your hand up if you want to stay behind. I'm happy to go through these things again with you. You have to communicate and communicate and communicate to parents, to staff, and to pupils. So you take it really seriously and explain why the rules are there. So I do think schools have to have, rules. I'm quite like, the detail matters to me. Uniform matters to me. The way children speak to adults matters to me. The way adults speak to children matters to me. All those things, but has to be led by that. So it has to be led from the front, really, from the head. So yeah, so it's a kind of melting pot of lots of different things going on together. So it has to come from the head, and headship is key, and leadership is key.
It's funny, so much of what you say, for me, feels very relatable to an adult environment in a company or in any organization. It's leadership from the top, really strong clarity, transparency with people. I think everyone wants to understand why things are the way they are. And even though that feels exhausting for leadership, I can totally see how that runs true in schools as well. Moving aside a little bit from your time as a head, I'm fascinated in the experience you had reviewing education in prisons. Mm-hmm. So for those who don't know, in 2015, I think, you were asked by the Lord Chancellor and the Justice Secretary to basically review education in prisons. It's a long report. I've read some of it. There's some really interesting stuff in there. I'd love you to just reflect in brief a little bit on what you took away from that experience and anything you think relatable, passing on to those who teach in mainstream education too.
Yeah, so I led the review because Michael Gove, who was the secretary, so at the time, I'd written to him because I had a child who'd been failed by the justice system. He'd been in Feltham, which is a young offenders institution, in his year 11. And as much as I tried as a head teacher of his school and other people tried to get him to sit GCSEs in Feltham, they failed to enter him for one GCSE. And he was a child in care with nothing going for him in his life, really, but he was very bright. And during the 6 months that he was in Feltham, I got revision books into him and things like that. But at the end of the day, Feltham failed to let him sit his GCSEs. And then he came out at the end of June without charge and without any GCSEs because he hadn't sat in here. I was absolutely furious because I felt that the justice system had allowed him to fall off the cliff. He's in a cell 23 hours out of 24. Why can't he be revising, which he was doing? Why can't he sit his GCSEs? And it just absolutely made me so angry. I wrote to Michael Gove. He spoke to me and then asked me to review education in prisons. Actually, I concentrated my review on adult education but I did go into young offenders institution. So what I learned was education is awful in prisons. A lot of prisoners, I believe it's something like 90%, have got very low literacy levels. They've mostly dropped out of school. They've been had very poor attendance. They've been brought up in care, or a lot of people in prison have been brought up in care, or they've been permanently excluded because of their behaviour, and they've gone to alternative provision and failed to, again, like this boy, sit any GCSEs or get a good education because alternative provision has been really poor. Although, in some cases it's not, but that's a generalisation. So they've committed crime, and they've ended up in prison, and now they're in prison and they're in a locked environment where you can do whatever you like with them, really, and they're failing to get any education because the education offered in prison is awful. If any teacher listening to this were to go around the classrooms in prisons, they would be appalled. They'd be judging every lesson inadequate. It's scrappy bits of paper, it's worksheets that are past their sell-by date, it's uninspirational classrooms, and then half the time, and it's kind of supply teacher level of teaching. And although, again, generalization, because I did meet some really good teachers, but on the whole I didn't. And it's mixed ability because you've got men or women in these classes, some of whom have got degrees and some of whom have got, can't read or write or speak English. And it's going through kind of tick box sort of checklists of kind of functional skills or different things, and it's just awful. So my report kind of said the things that should happen, and I still feel very strongly about some of those things happening to improve education in prisons. Because if you can train somebody to read and write to a certain level and give them a trade, when they come out of prison, they've got much more chance of not re-offending. And it costs us billions in as a country, in recidivism of people re-offending because they just fall back into crime because they've got no alternatives. Just makes complete nonsense, really. So what I learned in terms of education is the implications really of not tackling poor behaviour and allowing it to eventually, when it leads to a permanent exclusion, and people talk about the pipeline to prison, but it actually is a bit of a pipeline. Not everyone who gets permanently excluded ends up in prison, but a lot of people in prison have been permanently excluded. So you're much more likely, if you do get permanently excluded, to fail to get an education, to turn to crime, and maybe already you've been on the edge of youth justice by the time you do get permanently excluded. So, and then once you've been in prison, life becomes really, really difficult, because when you come out, it's difficult to get a job. Nobody wants to employ you. You just carry on committing crime. So this boy I talked about, who kind of metaphorically fell off that cliff, then went on 2 years later to attempt murder, and he's in prison for life now. And I could have stopped. I think I could have stopped that happening by getting him GCSEs and keeping him in sixth form. So no, it was very sanitary doing it.
Yeah, that was going to be my question, was the personal side of it, and sort of to take it forward from there. You find yourself in this very influential position to be able to say these really important things. I'm sure it was a wonderful experience in some ways, and probably an intrinsically very difficult one in others. Were you to find yourself in a great national position of responsibility to make sweeping changes to our education system, do you have really clear action plans that you want to put in place? Is there maybe perhaps one thing that you'd really like to make a change, which you think people are missing out on?
I'd really, well, first of all, it's difficult to know where to start. Just back on prisons, I'd really improve alternative provision and give it much more, working in alternative provision is perhaps working at the most difficult end of education. And therefore you need to give teachers in those sort of settings real status and real support in order to try and stop the pipeline happening. But fundamentally, at the moment, if we just go back to education generally, we have an enormous problem, because what I didn't talk about when I talked about behaviour was classroom teaching, which is a kind of another C, because if you're not getting good teaching, you're more likely to misbehave. And at the moment, we have an enormous problem of recruitment of teachers. I mean, it's just no joke. In some areas of the country, they cannot find a science teacher. In some areas of the country, A-level biology is being taught by somebody with a sports science degree. It's just shocking. And sometimes in the most disadvantaged areas, you have the most problem finding teachers. So if I were to do one thing, it would be to do everything possible to incentivize people to come into teaching, because the numbers have dramatically dropped. And if you can have all the wonderful things in the world in a school, but if you haven't got a good classroom teacher teaching you, a subject specialist, particularly in secondary education, then you're lost. You're never going to get the grade unless you're completely self-motivated. So I would do everything I possibly could to give more money to teachers, up their pay. I know we haven't got it, but something has to give, and to incentivize as much as I could getting people into teaching. Bursaries are fading away, and we all know that if there's a bursary, you're more likely to come into teaching. So subjects like science, maths, even geography, very hard now to attract people into those subjects. So that's one thing I would do. And sorry, I've got one more thing, which is I would massively, again, put something and support into early years, because if you get a child as early, what I have kind of learned is that problems start very early, and early years teaching is lacking in status, but actually before 5 round, are the most critical years. And so more time with parents, more support, more everything you possibly could to stop the cycle of disadvantage growing as children get older, and the gap between the haves and the have-nots getting wider and wider. So I'd throw money at the early years too.
Two good things there. Thank you. We could go we could go into depth on these for hours and hours. So perhaps another time, if we're lucky enough. I guess it'd be fun to finish on something anecdotal, maybe a bit of a story. As a head teacher, all these schools, all these settings, different environments, one of the great challenges you faced, I'd love to hear something that you found really difficult and perhaps how you overcame that challenge. I'm sure there are so many you could write books about them, but something which you've, I'm sure, enjoyed sharing.
Well, obviously one of the challenges was behaviour, because when I went into Burlington Danes, it was pretty awful. And there was a day when apparently before I started, when every single window in the building was broken, and believe you me, there was a lot of windows. So actually feeling brave enough to tackle behaviour in a big school and knowing not going in with anybody. So I had lack of support, although obviously I found it. But I'm trying to, I think, I'm giving kind of bad news stories, but I think tackling. So I think what I'm good at is having conversations with people which make them rethink what they're doing with their lives. And when I went into Burlington Danes, I had to have quite a lot of conversations with people who I thought shouldn't be there. And I'm very direct. I don't muck about. I don't fudge things. People walk into my office and before they've barely sat down, I've said, look, I don't think this is the right place for you to be. And, perhaps you should rethink what you're doing with your career. And I had to have a lot of those. In fact, I had, I think, 25 of those conversations in the first kind of half term with people. So I make up my mind quite quickly about things, probably sometimes too quickly, because I have to rethink initial impressions. But, I do think I make up my mind about things quite quickly and I act quite decisively. So I think it was a difficult thing to do, to know I had to shift a lot of people on because the children weren't getting a good deal. But if you think the most important thing in a school are the children and nothing else matters as much as them, then it makes it easier to have those conversations. I think some people find those conversations difficult. I find them not easy, but I can do them.
I think that's a great place to end. Be direct, say what you want to say, treat people with kindness, as you said earlier, create that culture, and the rest will take care of itself. We hope. I think it's a starting block for so much, though, isn't it? It's tell people what they need to hear. I think it's a really
don't accept second best.
Yeah, I agree. Sally, you've been so kind to share the time with us that you have. Each of those areas, I know we could pick apart for hours, and I hope you've got more books and podcasts and all the rest in you for the years ahead. We didn't even get on to what next for you. Perhaps one line on that. What are you really hoping to achieve this year?
Well, obviously, I want to get the best ever results at United Learn you've ever got. So I'm doing my absolute best in terms of outcomes and what happens in my schools. And as far as what's next, I have no idea.
Good place to be. Maybe you need someone to have a conversation with you and say, this is what I think you should do next.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, probably.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing what next for United and for you personally.
Okay, thank you. Okay, bye then.